Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might make your history teacher blush a little. The intimate world of feudal Japan, where love, desire, and human connection played out in ways that would seem utterly foreign to our modern sensibilities. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're living in Japan during the Heian period, roughly 1,000 years ago. Cherry blossoms drift past wooden shutters, incense burns in delicate bronze holders, and poetry flows like water through the imperial court. But beneath all that refined beauty lies a world of human desire that operated by rules so different from ours that it might as well have been another planet. This isn't the sanitized version of Japanese history you learned in school. This is the real story of how people loved, lusted, and connected in one of the most fascinating civilizations in human history. What I'm about to tell you tonight will completely reshape how you think about medieval societies. We tend to imagine the past as prudish, repressed, filled with people who barely acknowledge that bodies existed beneath all those layers of silk and ceremony. But feudal Japan was anything but repressed. In fact, their approach to intimacy was so open, so wonderfully complex, that it would make modern dating apps look positively primitive. Tonight, we're diving deep into the floating world of pleasure, the intricate dance of courtship, and the surprisingly frank attitudes toward physical love that defined Japanese society for centuries. We'll explore how samurai warriors balanced honor with desire, how court ladies wielded seduction like a political weapon, and how an entire culture developed around the art of human connection. This isn't just history. It's a window into a world where pleasure was considered an art form, where poetry and passion intertwined, and where the line between the sacred and the sensual was beautifully, deliberately blurred. But before we begin, let me warn you, this journey through feudal Japan's intimate landscape might challenge everything you think you know about love, relationships, and human nature itself. Because what we're about to discover is a society that understood something we've largely forgotten. That desire isn't something to be hidden or ashamed of, but rather a fundamental part of what makes us beautifully, gloriously human. The story begins in the Imperial court of Heian, Japan, where the very concept of romance was being invented. This wasn't the rough, brutal medieval world of European castles. This was a realm of aesthetic refinement so intense that the wrong shade of silk could end a political career. Court ladies spent hours arranging the 12 layers of their elaborate robes, each color carefully chosen to reflect the season, their mood, and their intentions. And those intentions, my friends, were often far more sophisticated than anything we see today. In this world, seduction was literature. A single poem, brushed in elegant calligraphy on handmade paper and tucked beneath a lady's door, could begin a love affair that would echo through generations. The quality of your handwriting mattered more than your bank account. The depth of your literary references carried more weight than your family connections. And the subtle interplay of revealed and concealed, of suggestion and restraint, created an erotic tension that could last for months or even years. Take Lady Murasaki, the brilliant author of The Tale of Genji, the world's first psychological novel. Her fictional prince Genji wasn't just a character. He was a template for how refined men should approach love and desire. Genji moved through the court like a master craftsman of the heart, understanding that true seduction happened in the mind long before it reached the body. He would catch a glimpse of a lady's sleeve trailing from beneath a bamboo blind, and that single flash of silk would inspire weeks of longing, poetry, and increasingly bold advances. But here's what makes this fascinating. In Heian court culture, physical beauty was just the starting point. What really mattered was mono-no-aware, the bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of all things. The most desirable lovers were those who understood that every moment of pleasure was shadowed by loss, that every touch carried the weight of eventual separation. This wasn't morbid, it was intoxicating. It meant that every encounter was precious, every caress was treasured, every night together was approached with the intensity of people who understood that nothing beautiful lasts forever. The court ladies weren't passive objects of desire either. They were players in a game so sophisticated that it would make modern pickup artists weep with envy. A woman might spend years crafting her reputation, carefully managing which poem she answered and which she ignored, building a mystique that could drive men to distraction. The most sought-after ladies were those who remained slightly out of reach, who gave just enough encouragement to keep hope alive while maintaining an air of impossible elegance. And when physical intimacy finally occurred, it happened within a framework of ritual and meaning that transformed the act into something approaching the sacred. The Japanese had developed an understanding of pleasure that went far beyond the mechanical. They recognized that the mind was the most important erogenous zone, and they spent centuries perfecting the art of mental seduction. This extended into the very architecture of love. Japanese homes were designed with intimate encounters in mind. Sliding screens could create instant privacy or deliberate revelation. The play of light and shadow across tatami mats became part of the experience. Even the seasons were considered integral to romance. Spring encounters were flavored with cherry blossoms and the promise of new life. Summer nights brought the intensity of festival drums and the humid press of desire. Autumn carried the melancholy beauty of falling leaves and the urgency of approaching winter. And winter intimacy was warmed by the glow of charcoal braziers and the weight of shared blankets. But perhaps most remarkably, feudal Japan developed a culture where multiple forms of love could coexist without shame or conflict. The same samurai who maintained a devoted marriage might also have passionate affairs with other men, relationships with courtisans, and deep emotional connections with fellow warriors. This wasn't seen as hypocrisy or betrayal. It was understood as the natural complexity of the human heart. The concept of homosexual love, particularly between men, was not only accepted but celebrated in certain contexts. The relationship between an older samurai and a younger apprentice was seen as a form of spiritual and physical mentorship. These relationships had their own rituals, their own poetry, their own aesthetic traditions. The older partner would teach not just swordsmanship and honor, but also the subtle arts of pleasure and emotional connection. Women, too, found ways to express desire that transcended the limited roles society officially offered them. Buddhist nuns wrote some of the most passionate poetry in Japanese literature, describing their longing for both spiritual and physical transcendence. Court ladies engaged in relationships with each other that combined deep friendship with sensual exploration, and the legendary female warriors, the Onna-bugeisha, brought the same fierce intensity to love that they showed on the battlefield. The rise of the merchant class during the later feudal period brought its own innovations to the landscape of desire. The pleasure quarters of cities like Kyoto and Edo became floating worlds where different rules applied. Here, courtesans weren't just providers of physical pleasure, they were artists, entertainers, and philosophers of love. A night with a top-ranked courtesan might involve hours of conversation, musical performance, poetry composition, and elaborate games of seduction before any physical contact occurred. These women understood something profound about human nature. They knew that true pleasure came from the building of anticipation, the careful orchestration of desire, and the recognition that the mind and body were inseparably connected. A skilled courtesan could make a man fall in love with her laugh, her way of arranging flowers, or the elegant curve of her wrist as she poured tea. The physical intimacy, when it finally came, was just the culmination of a much more complex and satisfying process. The tea ceremony itself became a form of sublimated eroticism. The careful attention to every movement, the appreciation of beauty in simple objects, the creation of an atmosphere of perfect harmony between host and guest. These rituals trained people to notice subtlety, to find pleasure in restraint, and to understand that the most intense experiences often came from the most delicate touches. This sensitivity extended to every aspect of intimate life. The Japanese developed an extraordinary vocabulary for describing different types of touch, different qualities of desire, different emotional states that accompanied physical pleasure. They understood that a caress given in autumn moonlight felt different from the same touch shared during a spring rain. They recognized that desire could be playful or profound, desperate or serene, and they created cultural spaces for all these variations. The samurai class brought their own unique perspective to the world of love and desire. These were people who lived constantly aware of death, who understood that any day might be their last. This created an intensity of experience that permeated every aspect of their lives, including their romantic relationships. When a samurai loved, he loved with the fierce concentration of someone who had stared death in the face and chosen life. The famous code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, included detailed instructions about how to conduct oneself in matters of love and honor. Loyalty was paramount, but it was a complex loyalty that could encompass multiple relationships without contradiction. A samurai might die for his lord, maintain deep devotion to his wife, and still find spiritual and physical connection with a fellow warrior or a courtesan. The key was sincerity. As long as each relationship was approached with genuine feeling and proper respect, there was no shame in the complexity of human desire. This understanding of love as multifaceted extended into the spiritual realm as well. Japanese Buddhism and Shintoism both recognized the sacred nature of physical pleasure when approached with the right mindset. The body wasn't seen as something to be transcended or denied, but as a vehicle for understanding deeper truths about existence. Sexual energy was considered a form of life force that could be channeled toward enlightenment when properly understood and directed. The result was a culture that produced some of the most sophisticated erotic art in human history. Japanese artists didn't just depict physical acts. They created entire worlds of sensual experience, capturing the emotional and spiritual dimensions of intimate connection. The famous shunga, or spring pictures, weren't just pornography. They were meditations on pleasure, explorations of human vulnerability, and celebrations of the beauty that could be found in moments of physical abandon. These images were often accompanied by poetry that elevated the physical to the sublime. A simple description of two bodies coming together might be transformed into a metaphor for the union of heaven and earth, the meeting of complementary forces that kept the universe in balance. This wasn't pretentious academic theorizing. This was a lived understanding that physical pleasure and spiritual insight were not opposites but partners in the dance of human experience. The elaborate courtship rituals that developed during the feudal period created a framework where desire could build slowly and sustainably. Unlike our modern culture of instant gratification, feudal Japan understood that the most intense pleasures came from patience, from the careful cultivation of longing, from the recognition that anticipation could be as satisfying as fulfillment. A typical courtship might begin with the exchange of poems, each carefully crafted to reveal just enough personality and desire to intrigue without overwhelming. If the literary exchange went well, there might be a glimpse through a bamboo screen, a brief meeting during a religious festival, or a carefully choreographed encounter in a garden where both parties could pretend the meeting was accidental. These early stages could last for months, with desire building through a series of increasingly intimate gestures, a shared glance during a court ceremony, a poem that referenced a private conversation, a gift of flowers chosen for their symbolic meaning. Each step was savored, each escalation celebrated, each new level of intimacy approached with the reverence due to something precious and irreplaceable. When physical intimacy finally occurred within these elaborate courtships, it was understood as a form of artistic collaboration. The lovers weren't just satisfying biological urges, they were creating something beautiful together, something that existed at the intersection of poetry, philosophy, and pure physical joy. The bedroom became a stage where two people could explore not just each other's bodies, but each other's souls. The Japanese developed techniques of lovemaking that emphasized patience, attention, and mutual pleasure in ways that were revolutionary for their time. They understood that true satisfaction came not from rushed encounters, but from the slow building of sensation, the careful attention to every response, the recognition that pleasure shared was pleasure multiplied. These weren't just physical techniques. They were spiritual practices that used the body as a gateway to deeper understanding. The pillow books of the era, detailed guides to intimate life, weren't crude manuals, but sophisticated explorations of human connection. They discussed not just positions and techniques, but emotions, timing, the importance of aftercare, and the delicate art of morning partings. They recognized that how you left someone after intimacy was just as important as how you approached them, that the end of an encounter set the tone for everything that might follow. These guides also acknowledge something that modern society often forgets, that desire changes with the seasons, with age, with circumstance. What pleased a young couple during cherry blossom season might be entirely different from what satisfied the same lovers during winter snow. The books provided frameworks for adaptation, for growing together rather than growing apart, for finding new sources of pleasure as bodies and hearts evolved over time. The concept of emma, the pregnant pause, the meaningful space between things, played a crucial role in Japanese approaches to intimacy. Just as a master painter knew when to leave empty space on a canvas, skilled lovers understood the power of restraint, of moments when not touching could be more electric than the most passionate caress. They learned to read the subtle signs of desire, to recognize when approach was welcome, and when distance would build more delicious tension. This understanding extended to the very language of love. Japanese developed an incredibly nuanced vocabulary for describing different states of attraction and connection. There were words for the specific pleasure of anticipation, for the melancholy that followed satisfaction, for the particular intimacy that came from sharing silence with another person. These weren't just poetic flourishes. They were tools for understanding and communicating the full spectrum of human experience. The seasonal nature of Japanese culture infused even the most private moments with layers of meaning. Spring encounters were associated with new beginnings, with the tender vulnerability of young shoots pushing through earth. The imagery of cherry blossoms, beautiful but ephemeral, reminded lovers that their time together was precious precisely because it wouldn't last forever. Summer brought the intensity of festival nights, the urgency of storms, the languorous heat that made clothing feel oppressive and skin crave contact. Autumn intimacy was flavored with the bittersweet beauty of falling leaves, the recognition that all things fade, but that this fading itself was part of their beauty. There was something particularly poignant about making love, while maple leaves drifted past the windows, a reminder that pleasure and loss were not opposites but dance partners in the eternal choreography of existence. Winter encounters had their own magic, the way shared warmth became more precious when snow blanketed the world outside, the intimacy of creating a small pocket of heat and connection in the vast, cold universe. The role of poetry in intimate relationships cannot be overstated. In feudal Japan, the ability to compose verse wasn't just an accomplishment, it was a necessity for anyone who hoped to experience deep connection with another person. Lovers communicated their desires, their satisfactions, their longings through carefully crafted poems that could be treasured long after physical passion had cooled. These weren't simple declarations of love, but complex artistic creations that revealed the writer's sensitivity, intelligence, and emotional depth. A skilled lover might compose a poem the morning after an encounter that captured not just the physical pleasure they had shared, but the emotional significance of the experience. They might reference classical literature, seasonal imagery, or religious concepts to place their personal experience within the larger framework of human understanding. Receiving such a poem was almost as satisfying as the original encounter. A gift that could be read and reread, that transformed memory into art. The exchange of poems also served practical purposes in a society where direct communication about intimate matters was often considered crude. A carefully constructed verse could convey desire without seeming pushy, could suggest future encounters without making demands, could express appreciation without reducing the beloved to mere physical pleasure. The poems became a form of emotional foreplay that could extend the satisfaction of an encounter for days or weeks. Women, despite the official constraints of their society, found remarkable ways to express agency and desire within these poetic frameworks. A court lady might compose verses that seemed demure on the surface but carried layers of erotic suggestion for those who knew how to read them. She could communicate her availability, her preferences, even her critiques of previous encounters, all while maintaining the appearance of perfect propriety. This verbal chess game became so sophisticated that the most respected courtesans were often those who could craft the most elegant and multi-layered poetry. The influence of Buddhist and Shinto spirituality on intimate life created a unique synthesis of the physical and metaphysical. Unlike Western traditions that often saw physical pleasure as a distraction from spiritual development, Japanese religious thought recognized the body as a legitimate path to enlightenment. The intense focus required for deep physical connection, the ego dissolution that came with peak pleasure, the compassion and tenderness that intimacy could cultivate were all seen as valuable spiritual practices. Tantric influences from Buddhism introduced concepts of energy circulation, of pleasure as a form of meditation, of the possibility that sexual union could become a gateway to transcendent states of consciousness. These weren't just theoretical concepts, but practical techniques that lovers could learn and practice together. The idea was that two people, through careful attention to breath, movement, and energy, could create experiences that transcended ordinary physical sensation and approached the sacred. Shinto contributed its own understanding of the body as inherently pure, of physical pleasure as a natural expression of life force, of sexuality as connected to fertility, creativity, and the ongoing renewal of the world. Shinto shrines often included fertility symbols and celebrated the generative power of sexual union. This created a cultural context where pleasure could be approached without shame, where the body was honored rather than condemned, where intimacy was seen as participation in cosmic creativity. The merchant class brought their own innovations to the landscape of desire as Japan's urban centers grew and prospered. The pleasure quarters that developed in cities like Edo and Kyoto became laboratories for new forms of intimate connection. Here, away from the rigid hierarchies of court and military society, different rules could apply. Merchants who had made their fortunes in trade could purchase experiences that rivaled those of aristocrats. Courtisans could accumulate wealth and influence that gave them independence unimaginable for women in other social classes. These pleasure quarters weren't just about sex. They were complete entertainment districts where art, music, literature, and sensuality combined to create immersive experiences of beauty and pleasure. A visitor might spend an entire evening listening to music, watching dance performances, engaging in sophisticated conversation, and gradually building toward intimate connection. The courtesans who worked in these districts were often more educated than many aristocratic women, skilled not just in physical pleasure, but in all the arts that made life worth living. The most successful courtesans understood that their real product wasn't sex, but fantasy, not just physical release, but emotional connection, not just momentary pleasure, but lasting memory. They created personas that captured men's imaginations, developed signature styles of dress and behavior that became their brands, cultivated the ability to make each client feel that he was experiencing something unique and special. This required extraordinary emotional intelligence and artistic skill. A top courtesan had to be part psychologist, part performer, part poet, part lover. She had to read her clients' deepest needs and desires, often ones they couldn't articulate themselves, and create experiences that satisfied longings they didn't even know they had. The most legendary courtesans were remembered not just for their beauty, but for their ability to transform men's understanding of what pleasure could be. The development of ukiyo-e, the floating world art that captured life in the pleasure quarters, created a visual vocabulary for representing intimate experience that was both explicit and deeply aesthetic. These weren't crude images, but sophisticated artistic explorations of human sexuality that recognized the beauty, humor, vulnerability, and transcendence that could be found in physical connection. The artists who created shunga understood that they were documenting not just physical acts, but emotional and spiritual realities. These images often included detailed backgrounds that placed intimate encounters within specific social and seasonal contexts. You might see lovers surrounded by the tools of their trades, suggesting that sexual identity was connected to social identity, that how people made their living influenced how they made love. Or the backgrounds might show seasonal flowers, suggesting that human passion was part of the same natural cycle that brought cherry blossoms in spring and maple leaves in fall. The humor that often appeared in shunga was particularly sophisticated, recognizing that laughter and pleasure were natural partners, that the ability to find joy and absurdity in intimate moments was a sign of emotional maturity rather than disrespect. Lovers who could laugh together during sex were understood to have achieved a level of comfort and connection that purely serious encounters couldn't match. As feudal society evolved and foreign influences began to penetrate Japan's isolation, attitudes toward sexuality became more complex and contradictory. The arrival of Christian missionaries introduced concepts of sexual shame that had been largely absent from traditional Japanese culture. Suddenly, practices that had been accepted for centuries were being labeled as sinful or immoral. The government's eventual embrace of these foreign moral standards created tension between official policy and popular practice. However, the deep cultural understanding of pleasure and intimacy that had developed over centuries couldn't be erased by official decree. Instead, it went underground, became more private, found expression in literature and art that had to be more subtle about its true subject matter. The sophistication of Japanese approaches to intimate life continued to evolve, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The legacy of feudal Japan's approach to sexuality and intimacy offers profound lessons for our modern world. Their understanding that pleasure was an art form worth studying and perfecting, that intimate connection required patience and skill, that the mind was the most important sexual organ, that seasonal and aesthetic awareness could enhance physical experience, all remain relevant today. Perhaps most importantly, their recognition that desire was complex, multifaceted, and deserving of respect rather than shame provides a model for approaching human sexuality with wisdom rather than anxiety. The tea ceremony became more than ritual in feudal Japan. It transformed into an elaborate dance of seduction where every gesture carried meaning. The way a woman's sleeve fell as she reached for the tea kettle, the precise angle at which she held her wrist while pouring, the deliberate pause before offering the cup. These weren't accidents. They were calculated moments designed to create desire through the most subtle of suggestions. Masters of the tea ceremony understood that anticipation was more powerful than revelation. A glimpse of ankle beneath silk robes could drive a man to distraction for weeks. The slow, methodical movements of the ceremony forced participants to exist in a state of heightened awareness where every sensation was amplified. The sound of water boiling became erotic. The steam rising from the teapot suggested other kinds of heat. The shared silence between host and guest created an intimacy that felt almost illicit. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of Japanese intimate culture was how they weaponized impermanence. The Buddhist concept of mono-no-aware, the pathos of things, turned temporary pleasure into something almost unbearably precious. When lovers understood that their time together was fleeting, that beauty faded, that all things passed away like cherry blossoms on the wind, every touch became sacred. Every kiss carried the weight of eventual loss. Every night together was approached with the intensity of people who knew it might be their last. This created a form of desire that was simultaneously desperate and serene. Desperate because time was limited. Serene because the acceptance of impermanence freed lovers from the need to possess or control. They could love fully precisely because they knew love wouldn't last forever. This paradox produced some of the most intense and satisfying intimate relationships in human history. The architecture of Japanese homes was designed to enhance this sense of impermanence and intimacy. Sliding screens could transform spaces instantly, creating private alcoves or opening rooms to gardens and moonlight. The play of shadows across tatami mats became part of the experience of love. Lovers learned to read the subtle changes in light that marked the passage of time, to find beauty in the way dawn slowly revealed bodies that had been hidden by darkness. Even the materials used in construction contributed to the erotic atmosphere. The slight give of tatami under bodies, the whisper of silk against bamboo screens, the subtle creaking of wooden joints as lovers moved together. These weren't distractions, but integral parts of the sensual experience. Japanese lovers learned to incorporate their environment into their pleasure, to find erotic potential in every aspect of their surroundings. The concept of ema, negative space, pregnant pauses, played a crucial role in Japanese approaches to physical intimacy. Just as traditional paintings used empty space to create emotional impact, skilled lovers understood when not to touch. They developed an exquisite sensitivity to rhythm and timing, knowing that restraint could build more intense pleasure than constant stimulation. A caress withheld at the perfect moment could create more desire than an hour of direct contact. This understanding of timing extended to entire relationships. Japanese culture developed elaborate protocols for the pacing of intimate connections. The first exchange of poems, the first glimpse through a screen, the first shared meal, the first night together. Each stage had its own rituals and significance. Rushing through these stages was considered not just rude, but aesthetically offensive. Like a master chef who understood that flavors needed time to develop, Japanese lovers knew that desire required patience to reach its full intensity. The seasonal awareness that permeated Japanese culture created a natural calendar for different types of intimate experience. Spring brought the tender vulnerability of new connections, flavored with cherry blossoms and the promise of renewal. Summer offered the intensity of festival nights, when social conventions relaxed and passion could burn more freely. Autumn provided the bittersweet pleasure of lovers who knew their time was limited, enhanced by the beauty of falling leaves and the approaching cold. Winter intimacy had its own magic. The way shared warmth became precious when snow covered the world outside. But it was during the summer festivals that Japanese intimate culture reached its most uninhibited expression. The normal social hierarchies temporarily dissolved. Merchants could court aristocrats. Servants could dance with their masters. The darkness and crowds provided cover for connections that would be impossible during ordinary times. The rhythmic beating of taiko drums seemed to synchronize with heartbeats, creating an atmosphere where desire felt not just permitted, but inevitable. These festivals were carefully orchestrated to maximize romantic possibility. Vendors sold sweet treats that had to be shared. Games required partners to work together. Fireworks displays provided moments of wonder that naturally led to intimacy. Even the traditional summer clothing, lighter robes that revealed more skin, seemed designed to inflame desire. The festivals became annual opportunities for the careful cultivation of passion that characterized Japanese intimate culture. The floating world of the pleasure quarters represented the ultimate refinement of these seasonal and aesthetic principles. Here, in districts like the Yoshiwara of Edo, time seemed suspended in an eternal present devoted entirely to pleasure. The architecture, the clothing, the entertainment, the very rhythm of daily life were all designed to create and sustain desire. These weren't crude brothels, but sophisticated pleasure palaces where every detail was crafted to enhance the experience of human connection. The courtesans who worked in these districts were artists of intimacy in the truest sense. They spent years learning not just physical techniques, but the entire cultural vocabulary of pleasure. They could compose poetry on demand, perform traditional dances, conduct elaborate tea ceremonies, and engage in sophisticated conversation on topics ranging from philosophy to politics. When they finally offered physical intimacy, it came as the culmination of a complete aesthetic experience. The most legendary courtesans were remembered not for their beauty alone, but for their ability to create emotional transformation in their clients. They could take a merchant exhausted by commercial concerns and help him rediscover wonder. They could show a samurai warrior moments of tenderness that balanced the violence of his profession. They could offer a traveling poet experiences of connection that enriched his art for years to come. These women developed techniques for reading their clients that bordered on the supernatural. They could detect desire in a glance, longing in a gesture, specific needs in the quality of a man's silence. They understood that different people required different approaches to pleasure, that what satisfied one client might leave another completely cold. They became masters of adaptation, able to shift their entire persona to match the psychological landscape of whoever sat before them. The economic independence that successful courtesans achieved was remarkable for women in feudal society. The most sought after could command prices that rivaled the annual income of minor nobles. They could own property, accumulate art collections, and even influence political decisions through their connections with powerful clients. Some retired to become teachers, passing their knowledge to the next generation of women entering the profession. But the pleasure quarters weren't exclusively focused on male clients. They also catered to women, both aristocrats seeking education in the arts of pleasure and merchants' wives looking for experiences unavailable in their conventional marriages. Female clients were often more demanding than men, requiring courtesans to demonstrate not just physical skill, but genuine emotional intelligence and artistic sophistication. The literature produced in and about the pleasure quarters created a new vocabulary for discussing intimate experience. Writers like Ihara Saikaku captured the psychological complexity of relationships that existed purely for pleasure, exploring how genuine emotion could develop even in commercial contexts. These works acknowledge the contradictions inherent in commodified intimacy, while celebrating the very real human connections that could emerge from it. The visual arts that emerged from this world pushed the boundaries of erotic representation in ways that remain influential today. Shunga artists didn't just depict physical acts, but entire emotional landscapes. Their images captured the vulnerability of nakedness, the comedy of awkward moments, the transcendence of perfect connection. They understood that true erotic art had to acknowledge the full range of human experience, not just its most idealized moments. The humor that pervaded much shunga was particularly sophisticated. Artists and viewers understood that laughter and pleasure were natural partners, that the ability to find joy and absurdity in intimate moments was a sign of emotional maturity. Lovers who could laugh together during sex were understood to have achieved a level of comfort and connection that purely serious encounters couldn't match. The religious dimensions of Japanese intimate culture created a unique synthesis of the physical and spiritual that had few parallels in other civilizations. Shinto shrines celebrated fertility and sexual energy as expressions of cosmic creativity. Buddhist temples, while officially promoting celibacy among monks, often acknowledge the spiritual potential of intimate connection when approached with proper mindfulness and compassion. This religious framework meant that pleasure could be pursued without the guilt and shame that characterized many other cultures. Physical desire was seen as natural, potentially sacred, worthy of cultivation rather than suppression. This didn't mean that anything went, but it did mean that sexuality was approached with respect rather than fear, curiosity rather than condemnation. The influence of Taoist concepts from China added another layer to Japanese understanding of intimate energy. The idea that sexual energy could be cultivated and circulated for health and spiritual development led to sophisticated practices that treated physical pleasure as a form of meditation. Lovers learned breathing techniques, energy circulation methods, and approaches to physical connection that could produce altered states of consciousness. These weren't just theoretical concepts, but practical techniques that couples could learn and develop together. The goal wasn't just physical satisfaction, but the creation of shared, transcendent experiences that could deepen emotional and spiritual bonds. The most accomplished practitioners claimed that proper sexual practice could extend life, enhance creativity, and provide insights into the fundamental nature of reality. The martial arts traditions of Japan also contributed to understanding of intimate connection. Samurai who had trained their bodies to move with precision and power brought the same attention to detail to physical love. They understood timing, leverage, the importance of being present in their bodies. The discipline required for mastery in combat translated naturally to mastery in pleasure. The code of Bushido included guidelines for conducting intimate relationships with honor and integrity. A samurai was expected to approach love with the same sincerity he brought to battle, to treat his partners with respect, and to maintain loyalty even when relationships became complex. This created a framework where multiple relationships could coexist without deception or betrayal, where honesty about desire was considered more honorable than false monogamy. The concept of giri, social obligation, interacted with ninjo, human feeling, in complex ways that shaped intimate relationships. A samurai might be obligated to marry for political reasons while maintaining passionate relationships elsewhere. The key was managing these competing demands with integrity, ensuring that duty didn't destroy genuine emotion and that emotion didn't undermine essential responsibilities. Women in samurai families developed their own codes for managing the intersection of desire and duty. They understood that their official role was to support their husband's career and produce heirs, but they also found ways to pursue personal satisfaction within these constraints. Some became accomplished in arts that attracted interesting partners. Others developed relationships with other women that provided emotional and physical intimacy unavailable in their marriages. The Onabugisha, female warriors, brought their own perspective to questions of love and power. These women had proven their courage in battle and often enjoyed more freedom than their purely domestic counterparts. They could choose partners based on attraction rather than just political convenience. Their relationships often involved equals meeting equals, creating dynamics that were rare in more conventional marriages. As Japan's isolation gradually gave way to foreign influence, the sophisticated culture of pleasure that had developed over centuries began to encounter external judgment and criticism. Christian missionaries were horrified by practices they considered sinful. Western diplomats were scandalized by the openness of Japanese attitudes toward sexuality. The Meiji government, eager to modernize and gain respect from Western powers, began implementing reforms that gradually suppressed many traditional approaches to intimate life. But the deep cultural wisdom about pleasure and connection that had developed over centuries couldn't be completely erased by official policy. It went underground, found expression in private literature and art, and continued to influence Japanese approaches to intimacy even as surface behaviors changed. The understanding that pleasure was an art worth studying, that intimate connection required skill and patience, that the mind was the most important sexual organ, all remained part of Japanese cultural DNA. The legacy of this sophisticated understanding of intimacy extended far beyond the bedroom. Japanese artisans began incorporating erotic motifs into everyday objects, transforming mundane items into subtle celebrations of desire. Ceramic tea bowls featured suggestive curves that echoed the human form. Textile patterns contained hidden symbols of fertility and passion that only the initiated could recognize. Even furniture was designed with intimate encounters in mind, with hidden compartments for love letters and surfaces that could be quickly transformed from formal to sensual. The development of kabuki theater provided another outlet for exploring themes of desire and passion. While the performances themselves were often stylized and formal, the stories they told frequently centered on forbidden love, tragic romance, and the conflict between duty and desire. Audiences could experience vicariously the intense emotions they might not be able to express in their own lives. The elaborate makeup and costumes of kabuki actors created a heightened reality where ordinary social constraints could be temporarily suspended. Behind the scenes, the world of kabuki was even more sexually fluid than the stories performed on stage. Male actors who specialized in playing women, called onagata, often maintained their feminine personas off-stage as well. They became objects of desire for both men and women, creating a unique category of gender-fluid sexuality that challenged conventional notions of attraction and identity. The traveling entertainers who performed between cities carried with them not just artistic skills, but also the latest innovations in pleasure and seduction. They served as informal networks for sharing knowledge about intimate techniques, spreading new ideas about desire and connection across the country. A courtesan in Kyoto might learn a new approach to massage from a traveling performer who had studied in Edo. A samurai in a remote castle might discover poetry styles that enhanced romantic correspondence through contact with wandering musicians. These informal networks ensured that Japanese culture remained dynamic and evolving, rather than static and traditional. New ideas about pleasure and intimacy could spread rapidly through society, tested and refined by countless practitioners before becoming established traditions. This created a culture of sexual innovation that was constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible in human connection. The influence of Chinese medical traditions added another dimension to Japanese understanding of sexual energy and pleasure. The concept of ki, or life force, was understood to flow through the body in specific patterns that could be enhanced or disrupted by various practices. Sexual activity, when properly conducted, was believed to strengthen and circulate this vital energy, promoting health, longevity, and spiritual development. Japanese physicians developed detailed maps of the body's energy pathways and identified specific techniques for stimulating the flow of ki through sexual practice. These weren't just physical techniques, but holistic approaches that integrated breathwork, meditation, dietary practices, and seasonal awareness. The goal was to transform sexual activity from a simple release of tension into a comprehensive practice for enhancing life force and achieving optimal health. Women were recognized as having particularly powerful sexual energy that could be cultivated for healing and spiritual purposes. Female practitioners developed techniques for strengthening their internal energy through specific exercises and breathing practices. They learned to channel this energy not just for personal benefit, but for healing their partners and creating harmonious relationships. The concept of sexual energy as medicine led to the development of therapeutic approaches to intimacy. Practitioners learned to diagnose energy imbalances in their partners and provide specific types of touch and stimulation to restore harmony. What might appear to be simple physical pleasure was actually sophisticated energy work designed to promote health and well-being. The seasonal festivals that punctuated the Japanese calendar provided regular opportunities for the community expression of sexual energy. During these celebrations, normal social constraints were temporarily relaxed, allowing for interactions that would be impossible during ordinary times. Young people could meet potential partners, married couples could rekindle passion, and even elderly people could participate in the celebration of life force and fertility. These festivals weren't chaotic orgies, but carefully orchestrated celebrations that channeled sexual energy in positive directions. Traditional dances encouraged physical contact between participants. Games required cooperation and trust between partners. The consumption of special foods and drinks was believed to enhance sexual energy and promote fertility. Even the timing of these festivals was calculated to coincide with natural cycles of energy and renewal. The most important of these celebrations was the Spring Fertility Festival, when the community gathered to ensure the success of the coming growing season. Participants engaged in ritual activities designed to awaken the Earth's creative power through human sexual energy. Young couples were encouraged to consummate their relationships during these festivals, believing that their passion would contribute to the fertility of the crops and the prosperity of the community. The autumn harvest festivals provided opportunities for celebrating the successful completion of the agricultural cycle, while also acknowledging the approaching dormancy of winter. These celebrations had a bittersweet quality, recognizing that the time of abundance was ending, but also appreciating the satisfaction that came from completing important work. Couples used these festivals to deepen their bonds before the isolation of winter months. The role of sake in Japanese intimate culture cannot be overlooked. This rice wine was more than just an intoxicant. It was considered a sacred substance that could facilitate communication between the human and divine realms. Sharing sake with a potential lover was a ritual act that signified the possibility of deeper connection. The gradual relaxation that came from drinking together allowed people to express desires and emotions that might otherwise remain hidden. Sake brewing itself became associated with sexual energy and fertility. The fermentation process was understood as a form of transformation, analogous to the changes that occurred during intimate connection. Master brewers developed rituals around the creation of sake that incorporated sexual symbolism and energy work. The finest sake was believed to be produced when the brewing process was infused with the creative energy of human passion. The tea houses where sake was served became informal centers for romantic connection. These establishments provided neutral spaces where people from different social classes could meet and interact. The architecture of tea houses, with their intimate alcoves and sliding screens, was designed to facilitate private conversation and gradual seduction. Skilled hostesses learned to read the dynamics between customers and subtly encourage promising connections. The art of flower arrangement, Ikebana, became another vehicle for expressing sexual energy and desire. The careful placement of stems and blossoms was understood to create energy patterns that could influence the emotions of viewers. Master arrangers learned to create compositions that evoked specific feelings, from gentle attraction to intense passion. Lovers exchanged flower arrangements as a form of nonverbal communication about their desires and intentions. The choice of flowers carried elaborate symbolic meanings that allowed for sophisticated communication about intimate matters. A single cherry blossom might suggest fleeting desire, while arrangement of peonies could indicate deep, lasting passion. Pine branches suggested endurance and faithfulness, while bamboo indicated flexibility and adaptability. A skilled practitioner of Ikebana could compose entire conversations about love and desire using nothing but carefully chosen plants. The spaces where these flower arrangements were displayed became charged with erotic energy. A tokonoma, the alcove in a traditional Japanese room reserved for displaying art, might contain an arrangement that set the emotional tone for whatever interactions occurred in that space. Lovers learned to read these floral messages and respond with arrangements of their own, creating ongoing dialogues that could last for months. The integration of natural cycles into human sexuality reached its most sophisticated expression in the practice of phenology, the study of seasonal changes in plants and animals. Japanese lovers became expert observers of natural phenomena, learning to align their intimate lives with the rhythms of the natural world. They understood that human sexual energy waxed and waned with the seasons, and they adjusted their expectations and practices accordingly. Spring brought the energy of new beginnings and fresh desire. Lovers during this season focused on exploration, discovery, and the cultivation of new connections. The gradual warming of the weather paralleled the gradual warming of relationships. Physical intimacy during spring was characterized by tenderness, curiosity, and gentle experimentation. Summer brought the peak of sexual energy, corresponding to the maximum daylight and warmth of the year. This was the season for intense passion, for relationships that burned bright and consumed everything in their path. Summer lovers embraced the fullness of desire without restraint, understanding that this intensity was temporary and should be experienced fully while it lasted. Autumn brought a different quality of intimacy, colored by the awareness of approaching endings. The beauty of falling leaves reminded lovers that all things passed away, making each moment of connection more precious. Autumn intimacy was characterized by depth, appreciation, and the bittersweet recognition that pleasure was always temporary. Winter intimacy focused on warmth, comfort, and the sustaining power of deep connection. When the external world was cold and barren, lovers created internal worlds of heat and life. Winter was the season for exploring the subtler forms of pleasure, for developing the patience and sensitivity that could sustain relationships through difficult periods. This seasonal awareness extended to every aspect of intimate life, from the foods consumed before lovemaking to the specific techniques employed during different times of year. Lovers learned to adjust their expectations and approaches based on natural cycles, understanding that fighting against seasonal rhythms was less effective than working with them. The philosophical schools that developed around these practices created sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding the relationship between human sexuality and cosmic harmony. These weren't dry academic exercises, but practical philosophies that guided people in their daily lives. The most influential teachers combined deep theoretical knowledge with extensive practical experience, offering guidance that was both intellectually satisfying and immediately useful. Students of these sexual philosophies learned to see intimate connection as a form of spiritual practice that could lead to profound insights about the nature of existence. They understood that the ego dissolution that occurred during peak sexual experiences offered glimpses of the interconnectedness that mystics described in their writings. Physical pleasure became a gateway to transcendent understanding when approached with proper awareness and intention. The training programs developed for courtesans and other sexual practitioners represented some of the most sophisticated education in human psychology and physiology available anywhere in the world. Students learned anatomy, psychology, poetry, music, dance, and dozens of other skills that contributed to their ability to create transformative, intimate experiences. The most advanced practitioners were considered artists of the highest caliber, worthy of respect and admiration from even the most educated members of society. The economic systems that supported this elaborate culture of pleasure created opportunities for social mobility that were rare in feudal societies. Talented individuals could rise from humble origins to positions of wealth and influence through mastery of intimate arts. This created incentives for innovation and excellence that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in human connection. The international reputation that Japanese intimate culture eventually acquired influenced sexual practices in other parts of Asia and even reached European explorers and traders. Foreign visitors were often shocked by the sophistication and openness of Japanese approaches to sexuality, leading to both admiration and condemnation from different cultural perspectives. These cross-cultural encounters enriched Japanese practices while also creating pressure for conformity to international standards. The written records that survive from this period provide invaluable insights into how ordinary people experienced sexuality and intimacy. Personal diaries, letters between lovers, and instructional texts reveal a culture that was remarkably frank about desire, while also being deeply sophisticated about the emotional and spiritual dimensions of human connection. These documents show that the elaborate theories and practices were not just elite pursuits, but were integrated into the daily lives of people from all social classes. The artistic legacy of Japanese intimate culture continues to influence contemporary understanding of sexuality and relationships. The aesthetic principles developed during the feudal period, emphasizing harmony, balance, seasonal awareness, and the integration of physical and spiritual dimensions, offer alternatives to the more mechanistic approaches that often characterize modern sexuality. The recognition that pleasure is an art form worthy of study and cultivation provides a framework for approaching intimate life with greater skill and satisfaction. The medical knowledge that emerged from centuries of careful observation and experimentation created understanding of human sexuality that was remarkably advanced for its time. Japanese practitioners identified connections between emotional states and physical responses that wouldn't be recognized by Western medicine for centuries. They developed techniques for enhancing sexual function and satisfaction that combined physical interventions with psychological and spiritual practices. The social innovations that allowed for the coexistence of multiple types of relationships within the same individual's life offered models for managing the complexity of human desire that remain relevant today. The understanding that monogamy was one choice among many, rather than the only acceptable option, created space for people to find arrangements that matched their actual needs rather than forcing themselves into predetermined patterns. The psychological insights that Japanese intimate culture produced were perhaps its most remarkable achievement. Practitioners developed an understanding of human desire that recognized its fundamental complexity and contradictory nature. They understood that people could simultaneously crave novelty and stability, intimacy and independence, surrender and control. Rather than seeing these contradictions as problems to be solved, they embraced them as the natural texture of human experience. This psychological sophistication manifested in practical techniques for reading and responding to emotional states. Skilled lovers learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated what type of connection their partner needed at any given moment. Sometimes the same person might require gentle comfort, at other times intense passion, and at still other times playful experimentation. The ability to perceive and respond to these shifting needs was considered one of the highest forms of intimate artistry. The concept of emotional seasons within relationships paralleled the natural seasons that so deeply influenced Japanese culture. New relationships were understood to go through predictable phases, each with its own characteristics and requirements. The spring phase brought excitement and discovery, but also uncertainty and vulnerability. The summer phase offered intensity and passion, but could also lead to burnout if not properly managed. The autumn phase provided depth and appreciation, but required acceptance of approaching changes. The winter phase demanded patience and sustaining warmth, but could lead to the most profound forms of connection. Master practitioners taught students to recognize these relationship seasons and adjust their approach accordingly. Fighting against the natural progression of emotional development was seen as futile and destructive. Instead, lovers learned to embrace each phase fully while preparing for the inevitable transitions that would follow. This created relationships that could evolve and deepen over time, rather than burning out or becoming stagnant. The training programs that prepared people for lives as professional pleasure providers included extensive education in what we would now call emotional intelligence. Students learned to manage their own psychological states while simultaneously attending to the needs of their clients. They developed techniques for maintaining emotional boundaries without becoming cold or distant, for offering genuine connection without losing themselves in the process. These programs also taught advanced skills in psychological manipulation, though this was understood as a form of beneficial influence rather than exploitation. Students learned how to help clients overcome inhibitions that prevented them from experiencing pleasure, how to build confidence in those who felt inadequate, how to provide healing experiences for those who had been wounded by previous relationships. The goal was always to leave clients feeling better about themselves and more capable of connection in their ordinary lives. The philosophical frameworks that supported these practices drew from multiple traditions while creating something uniquely Japanese. Confucian concepts of harmony and social order were integrated with Buddhist understandings of impermanence and compassion. Taoist ideas about energy circulation combined with Shinto celebrations of natural fertility. The result was a coherent worldview that could accommodate both spiritual aspiration and physical desire without internal contradiction. This philosophical integration created practitioners who could discuss intimate matters with remarkable sophistication and nuance. They could explain the relationship between specific physical techniques and broader spiritual principles, helping clients understand how personal pleasure connected to cosmic harmony. This elevated sexual experience from mere physical gratification to a form of participation in universal creativity. The architectural innovations that emerged from this culture created spaces specifically designed to enhance intimate experience. Rooms were proportioned according to principles that promoted relaxation and openness. Lighting was carefully controlled to create atmosphere without harsh shadows. Air circulation was managed to prevent stuffiness while maintaining warmth. Even the materials used in construction were chosen for their sensual qualities, the way they felt against skin, the sounds they made when touched, the subtle fragrances they released. The most sophisticated establishments included rooms designed for different types of encounters and moods. Some spaces were created for gentle, contemplative connection, with soft textures and muted colors that promoted relaxation. Others were designed for more intense passion, with bold decorations and furniture that could withstand vigorous activity. Still, others were configured for group encounters, with flexible arrangements that could accommodate various configurations of participants. The integration of natural elements into these designed spaces reflected the deep connection between human sexuality and natural cycles. Water features provided the sound of flowing streams that masked intimate sounds while creating a connection to natural fertility. Garden views brought seasonal changes into the experience of lovemaking. The careful placement of plants and flowers created living environments that changed throughout the year, ensuring that the same space could offer different experiences at different times. The economic implications of this elaborate culture were significant for Japanese society as a whole. The pleasure districts employed thousands of people in various capacities, from the courtesans themselves to the artists, musicians, servants, and craftspeople who supported their activities. This created a substantial economic sector devoted entirely to the pursuit of human pleasure and connection. The wealth generated by these activities flowed throughout society, supporting artists and artisans whose work might otherwise have lacked patronage. The demand for luxury goods to enhance intimate experiences drove innovation in textiles, ceramics, furniture making, and other crafts. The cultural sophistication required to succeed in the pleasure trade created educational opportunities that benefited society more broadly. The taxation systems that governments developed to capture revenue from pleasure activities had to balance moral considerations with practical financial needs. Officials who might personally disapprove of commercial sexuality still recognized its economic importance. This led to complex regulatory frameworks that attempted to control and contain these activities while still allowing them to generate revenue. The international trade connections that developed around luxury goods used in intimate contexts brought Japan into contact with materials and techniques from across Asia. Silk from China, spices from Southeast Asia, precious stones from India, all found their way into the elaborate costumes and settings that enhanced sexual experience. This created cultural exchanges that influenced Japanese practices, while also spreading Japanese innovations to other countries. The literary traditions that emerged from this world created new genres of writing that explored the psychological and emotional dimensions of intimate relationships. These works were often remarkably frank about physical desire, while also being deeply sensitive to the emotional complexities that surrounded sexual experience. Authors developed techniques for describing intimate encounters that were both explicit and poetic, crude and refined, realistic and idealized. The most successful works in this tradition managed to capture the full spectrum of human sexual experience, from awkward fumbling to transcendent ecstasy. They acknowledged the comedy and tragedy that could coexist in intimate moments, the way desire could transform people into both angels and fools. These writings provided models for understanding sexual experience that were far more nuanced than the simple celebration or condemnation that characterized most other cultures. The influence of these literary works extended far beyond their immediate audience. They shaped expectations about what intimate relationships could and should provide, creating cultural standards that influenced how people approached their own sexual lives. Young people learned from these stories what was possible in human connection, while experienced lovers found validation for their own complex experiences. The educational systems that developed around these literary traditions created some of the first formal programs for sexual education in human history. Students learned not just physical techniques, but also the cultural and philosophical contexts that gave meaning to intimate experience. They studied the relationship between desire and morality, the connection between personal pleasure and social harmony, the ways that sexual energy could be channeled towards spiritual development. These educational programs produced graduates who could serve as teachers, counselors, and guides for others seeking to improve their intimate lives. They created a professional class of sexual educators who could provide guidance based on centuries of accumulated wisdom and experience. This professionalization of sexual knowledge ensured that innovations and insights would be preserved and transmitted across generations. The medical traditions that emerged from careful observation of sexual practices created understanding of human physiology that was remarkably advanced. Practitioners identified connections between emotional states and physical responses that wouldn't be recognized by Western medicine for centuries. They developed techniques for diagnosing and treating sexual dysfunction that combined physical interventions with psychological and spiritual approaches. The pharmacological knowledge that emerged from this tradition included detailed understanding of plants and minerals that could enhance sexual function and pleasure. These weren't just crude aphrodisiacs, but sophisticated preparations that could address specific issues while supporting overall health. The preparation and administration of these substances required extensive training and careful attention to individual needs and circumstances. The diagnostic techniques developed by these medical practitioners included methods for assessing sexual health that went far beyond simple physical examination. They learned to read subtle signs in posture, breathing, skin tone, and energy levels that indicated various forms of sexual dysfunction or imbalance. Their treatments addressed not just symptoms but underlying causes, often requiring lifestyle changes and spiritual practices as well as physical interventions. The preventive approaches that emerged from this medical tradition emphasized the maintenance of sexual health through proper diet, exercise, meditation, and relationship practices. Practitioners understood that sexual dysfunction was often the result of broader health problems or psychological issues. Their treatments aimed to restore overall well-being, rather than simply addressing sexual symptoms in isolation. The surgical techniques that developed for addressing severe sexual dysfunction were remarkably sophisticated given the limited technology available. Practitioners developed procedures for correcting anatomical problems that interfered with sexual function, using techniques that required extraordinary skill and precision. These interventions were typically reserved for cases where other approaches had failed, and they were performed with careful attention to preserving both function and sensation. The psychological therapeutic approaches that emerged from this tradition created some of the earliest forms of sex therapy in human history. Practitioners developed techniques for helping people overcome trauma, anxiety, and other psychological barriers to sexual satisfaction. They understood that many sexual problems were rooted in emotional issues that required careful and sensitive treatment. The couples counseling techniques that developed within this tradition recognized that sexual problems were often symptoms of broader relationship issues. Therapists learned to work with couples to improve communication, resolve conflicts, and rebuild intimacy. They developed exercises and practices that couples could use to gradually restore their sexual connection while strengthening their overall relationship. The group therapy approaches that emerged for addressing sexual issues created supportive communities where people could share experiences and learn from one another. These groups provided safe spaces for discussing intimate matters that couldn't be addressed in ordinary social contexts. Participants learned that their struggles were not unique and that solutions were possible with proper support and guidance. The spiritual counseling that was integrated into sexual therapy recognized that many intimate problems had spiritual dimensions that required attention. Practitioners learned to help clients understand the connection between their sexual experiences and their broader spiritual development. They provided guidance for integrating sexual practice with meditation, prayer, and other spiritual disciplines. The social reform movements that emerged from this sophisticated understanding of sexuality began to challenge traditional restrictions and taboos that prevented people from experiencing healthy sexual lives. Reformers argued that sexual ignorance and repression created more problems than sexual education and openness. They worked to create social conditions that would allow people to pursue intimate fulfillment without shame or fear. These reform movements had to navigate complex political and religious opposition while building support for more enlightened approaches to sexuality. They used the accumulated wisdom of centuries of sexual practice to argue for changes in law and social policy. Their efforts gradually created more space for sexual diversity and experimentation while maintaining social stability and order. The international influence of these reform ideas began to spread Japanese approaches to sexuality to other parts of the world. Foreign visitors who experienced Japanese sexual culture often returned to their home countries with new ideas about what was possible in intimate relationships. This cross-cultural pollination enriched sexual practices globally while also creating pressure for Japan to conform to international standards. The modern legacy of feudal Japanese sexual culture continues to influence contemporary understanding of intimacy and desire. The aesthetic principles developed during this period, emphasizing harmony, seasonal awareness, and the integration of physical and spiritual dimensions, offer alternatives to more mechanistic approaches to sexuality. The recognition that pleasure is an art form worthy of study and cultivation provides frameworks for approaching intimate life with greater skill and satisfaction. The psychological insights that emerged from centuries of careful observation and experimentation created understanding of human sexuality that remains relevant today. The recognition that desire is complex and contradictory, that relationships go through predictable phases, that sexual problems often reflect broader life issues, all continue to inform contemporary therapeutic approaches. The social innovations that allowed for diverse forms of relationship and sexual expression offer models for managing the complexity of modern intimate life. The understanding that different people have different needs, that relationships can take many forms, that sexual diversity should be celebrated rather than suppressed, all provide guidance for creating more inclusive and satisfying approaches to human connection. The artistic and literary achievements that emerged from this culture continue to inspire contemporary creators exploring themes of sexuality and desire. The sophisticated integration of explicit content with aesthetic beauty, the nuanced exploration of psychological and emotional dimensions of intimate experience, the celebration of physical pleasure as a legitimate subject for serious artistic treatment, all provide models for contemporary work. The technological innovations that emerged from the practical needs of this culture, from architectural designs that enhanced intimate experience to medical devices that addressed sexual dysfunction, continue to influence contemporary approaches to sexual health and pleasure. The understanding that technology should serve human needs rather than replacing human connection remains a valuable principle in our increasingly digital age. The philosophical frameworks that integrated sexual practice with spiritual development offer alternatives to both puritanical repression and hedonistic excess. The recognition that intimate connection can be a path to transcendence, that physical pleasure can serve spiritual development, that the body is a legitimate vehicle for exploring ultimate reality, all provide resources for contemporary seekers looking for more integrated approaches to sexuality and spirituality. The educational systems that flourished around these intimate practices created institutions that had no equivalent anywhere else in the world. These weren't simple apprenticeships or crude instruction manuals. They were comprehensive academies that treated the study of human connection as seriously as any other scholarly discipline. Students spent years learning not just physical techniques but the entire cultural matrix that gave meaning to intimate experience. The curriculum in these schools was remarkably sophisticated. Beginning students learned basic anatomy and physiology, studying the body as a landscape of sensation and response. They memorized the classical texts that described different approaches to pleasure, analyzed poetry that captured the emotional dimensions of desire, and practiced calligraphy until they could compose love letters that were works of art in their own right. Advanced students delved into psychology, learning to read the subtle signs that revealed a person's deepest needs and desires. They studied seasonal variations in human energy and mood, understanding how the changing weather affected both physical and emotional states. They learned to recognize the difference between surface attraction and deeper compatibility, between momentary lust and sustainable passion. The most advanced practitioners studied what might be called the metaphysics of desire. They explored the connections between personal pleasure and cosmic harmony, learning to see intimate encounters as opportunities for spiritual insight. These students often spent months in meditation and contemplation, developing the inner stillness that allowed them to remain centered, even in the midst of intense physical and emotional experience. The teaching methods employed in these institutions were as innovative as their curriculum. Rather than relying solely on verbal instruction, teachers used elaborate role-playing exercises that allowed students to practice reading emotional cues and responding appropriately. They created simulated scenarios where students had to navigate complex social and intimate situations, building the confidence and skill needed for real-world application. The assessment methods were equally sophisticated. Students weren't just tested on their theoretical knowledge, but on their ability to create genuine emotional connection with their practice partners. Teachers observed their ability to maintain presence and awareness during intimate encounters, their sensitivity to their partner's responses, and their skill at adapting their approach based on feedback. The graduation ceremonies from these institutions were elaborate affairs that acknowledged the profound transformation students had undergone. These weren't just academic achievements, but spiritual initiations that marked the transition from student to master practitioner. Graduates received not just certificates, but sacred objects that symbolized their commitment to using their skills for the benefit of others. The continuing education programs that these institutions offered ensured that practitioners could continue developing their skills throughout their careers. Advanced workshops explored specialized techniques. Cultural exchanges brought teachers from other traditions to share their knowledge, and research programs investigated new approaches to enhancing human connection. The libraries associated with these schools contained some of the most comprehensive collections of literature on human sexuality ever assembled. These weren't just practical manuals, but philosophical treatises, psychological analyses, artistic explorations, and spiritual guides that treated intimate experience as worthy of the deepest scholarly attention. The research programs conducted at these institutions pushed the boundaries of knowledge about human sexuality in remarkable ways. Scholars conducted careful observations of how different techniques affected physical and emotional responses. They documented the variations in sexual energy that occurred with seasonal changes. They explored the connections between diet, exercise, meditation practices, and sexual satisfaction. The medical wings of these institutions became centers for treating sexual dysfunction and relationship problems. Practitioners developed therapeutic approaches that combined physical treatments with psychological counseling and spiritual guidance. They created safe spaces where people could discuss intimate problems without shame or judgment. The artistic studios associated with these schools produced some of the most sophisticated erotic art in human history. Artists worked closely with practitioners to create visual representations that captured not just physical acts, but the emotional and spiritual dimensions of intimate experience. These works served both as educational tools and as celebrations of human sexuality. The performance spaces within these institutions hosted events that combined entertainment with education. Audiences could watch demonstrations of various techniques while enjoying music, poetry, and dance that celebrated the full spectrum of human desire. These performances helped normalize conversations about sexuality while maintaining appropriate aesthetic distance. The international exchange programs that developed between Japanese institutions and similar schools in other countries created opportunities for cross-cultural learning that enriched practices in multiple traditions. Japanese students traveled to study tantric techniques in India, Chinese energy cultivation methods, and even the more psychological approaches that were beginning to develop in some European contexts. The publication programs associated with these institutions produced literature that spread sophisticated understanding of sexuality throughout Japanese society and beyond. These works ranged from practical guides for ordinary couples to advanced texts for professional practitioners. The quality of writing and illustration in these publications was often extraordinary, reflecting the high value placed on aesthetic excellence in all aspects of intimate culture. The social reform initiatives that emerged from these educational institutions began to challenge traditional restrictions that limited human sexual expression. Graduates often became advocates for more enlightened approaches to sexuality, using their expertise to argue for changes in law and social policy. Their influence gradually created more space for sexual diversity and experimentation while maintaining social stability. The economic impact of these educational institutions was substantial. They employed thousands of teachers, administrators, artists, and support staff. The students who graduated from them went on to create their own businesses and institutions, generating economic activity that rippled throughout society. The luxury goods and services that supported this elaborate educational infrastructure created markets for craftspeople and artists. The political influence wielded by these institutions reflected the high regard in which sexual expertise was held in Japanese society. Graduates often advised political leaders on matters relating to social policy, public health, and international relations. Their understanding of human nature and relationship dynamics proved valuable in contexts far removed from the bedroom. The technological innovations that emerged from the practical needs of these institutions contributed to broader advances in Japanese craftsmanship and engineering. The furniture, architectural features, and specialized equipment developed for sexual education and practice influenced design in other areas. The precision and attention to detail required for intimate arts translated into excellence in other fields. The spiritual movements that grew out of these educational institutions created new forms of religious practice that integrated sexual experience with traditional Buddhist and Shinto observances. These movements attracted followers who were seeking more embodied approaches to spiritual development, alternatives to the sometimes austere practices of traditional monasticism. The therapeutic communities that formed around these institutions provided support for people dealing with sexual trauma, relationship difficulties, and other intimate problems. These communities created healing environments where people could recover from harmful experiences while learning healthier approaches to sexuality and relationship. The artistic movements that emerged from the creative work done at these institutions influenced Japanese aesthetics in profound ways. The integration of sensual and spiritual themes, the celebration of physical beauty, the sophisticated treatment of desire and pleasure, all became characteristic elements of Japanese artistic expression that continued to influence contemporary culture. The philosophical schools that developed around the theoretical work done at these institutions created new frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual pleasure and social harmony. These philosophies influenced political theory, educational practice, and social policy in ways that extended far beyond questions of sexuality. The scientific research conducted at these institutions contributed to understanding of human physiology and psychology that was remarkably advanced for its time. The careful observation of sexual responses, the documentation of individual variations in desire and satisfaction, the exploration of connections between physical and emotional states, all created knowledge that wouldn't be matched by Western science for centuries. The international reputation that these institutions developed attracted students and visitors from throughout Asia and eventually from Europe and other distant regions. This created cultural exchanges that enriched Japanese practices while also spreading Japanese innovations to other parts of the world. The influence of Japanese approaches to sexuality can be traced in the development of similar institutions in China, Korea, and eventually even in some Western countries. The literary traditions that emerged from the creative work done at these institutions produced some of the most sophisticated explorations of human sexuality ever written. These works combined explicit content with aesthetic beauty, psychological insight with spiritual depth, practical guidance with artistic expression. They created models for writing about sexuality that influenced literature throughout the world. The dramatic traditions that developed around these institutions created new forms of theatrical performance that explored themes of desire, pleasure, and human connection. These performances provided safe spaces for audiences to explore their own feelings about sexuality while enjoying entertainment that was both aesthetically sophisticated and emotionally satisfying. The musical traditions that emerged from these institutions created new forms of composition and performance that incorporated the rhythms and emotional textures of sexual experience. Musicians learned to create soundscapes that could enhance intimate encounters while also serving as independent artistic expressions worthy of concert performance. The dance traditions that developed around these institutions created movement vocabularies that expressed the full range of human sexual experience. Dancers learned to embody desire, pleasure, longing, satisfaction, and all the other emotional states that accompanied intimate connection. These dance forms influenced broader traditions of Japanese movement and performance. The architectural innovations that emerged from the practical needs of these institutions influenced Japanese building design in fundamental ways. The attention to proportion, lighting, air circulation, acoustic properties, and material selection that was essential for creating optimal, intimate environments became characteristic features of Japanese architecture more generally. The garden design traditions that developed around these institutions created outdoor spaces that enhanced and supported intimate experience. These gardens incorporated elements that stimulated all the senses while providing privacy and beauty. The principles developed for these specialized spaces influenced Japanese garden design throughout the country. The textile traditions that emerged from the clothing and furnishing needs of these institutions pushed the boundaries of Japanese fabric production and design. The demand for materials that were beautiful, comfortable, and conducive to intimate experience drove innovations in weaving, dyeing, and garment construction that influenced fashion and interior design. The ceramic traditions that developed around the specialized needs of these institutions created new forms of pottery and porcelain that served both practical and aesthetic functions. Vessels designed for ritual use in intimate contexts required extraordinary skill and sensitivity to create. The techniques developed for these specialized items influenced Japanese ceramics more broadly. The metalworking traditions that emerged from the tool and equipment needs of these institutions created new approaches to crafting objects that were both functional and beautiful. The precision and attention to detail required for intimate implements influenced Japanese metalworking in other areas, contributing to the legendary quality of Japanese blades and tools. The woodworking traditions that developed around the furniture and architectural needs of these institutions created new techniques for working with wood that emphasized both strength and sensual appeal. The furniture designed for intimate use required extraordinary craftsmanship and attention to how materials felt against the human body. The lacquerwork traditions that emerged from the finishing needs of these institutions created new approaches to surface treatment that enhanced both beauty and tactile appeal. The lacquers developed for intimate furnishings had to meet demanding standards for durability, appearance, and sensual qualities. The perfume and incense traditions that developed around these institutions created sophisticated approaches to scent that could enhance mood and create atmosphere conducive to intimate experience. These aromatic arts influenced Japanese approaches to scent in many other contexts, from religious ceremonies to domestic life. The culinary traditions that emerged from the dietary needs of these institutions created new approaches to food that emphasized both nutrition and sensual pleasure. The understanding that diet affected sexual energy and satisfaction led to the development of specialized cuisines that supported optimal intimate experience. The beverage traditions that developed around these institutions created new approaches to drinks that could enhance relaxation, stimulate energy, or create specific emotional states. These traditions influenced Japanese tea culture, sake brewing, and the development of other specialized beverages. The bathing traditions that emerged from the hygiene and pleasure needs of these institutions created sophisticated approaches to water therapy that combined cleanliness with sensual enjoyment. These traditions influenced the development of Japanese bathing culture, from private home baths to elaborate public facilities. The massage traditions that developed at these institutions created therapeutic approaches to touch that addressed both physical and emotional needs. These traditions combined medical knowledge with intuitive understanding of how touch could heal, relax, and energize. The techniques developed in intimate contexts influenced broader traditions of Japanese bodywork and healing. The meditation traditions that emerged from the spiritual dimensions of these institutions created new approaches to contemplative practice that incorporated awareness of the body and its sensations. These traditions offered alternatives to more austere forms of meditation while maintaining serious commitment to spiritual development. The exercise traditions that developed around the physical conditioning needs of these institutions created new approaches to movement and fitness that emphasized grace, strength, and sensual awareness. These traditions influenced Japanese martial arts, dance, and general approaches to physical culture. The healing traditions that emerged from the medical dimensions of these institutions created holistic approaches to health that recognize the connections between sexual satisfaction, emotional well-being, and physical vitality. These traditions influenced Japanese medicine in fundamental ways, creating more integrated approaches to health and healing. The counseling traditions that developed around the psychological needs of these institutions created new approaches to therapy that addressed relationship issues, sexual dysfunction, and emotional trauma with unprecedented sophistication. These traditions influenced Japanese approaches to mental health and social work. The social work traditions that emerged from the community service dimensions of these institutions created new approaches to helping people who were struggling with intimate problems or social isolation. These traditions recognized that sexual health was connected to broader social well-being and worked to create supportive communities for all members of society. The legal traditions that developed around the regulatory needs of these institutions created new approaches to law that balanced individual freedom with social responsibility. These traditions influenced Japanese legal thinking about privacy, consent, commercial regulation, and social order. The economic traditions that emerged from the business dimensions of these institutions created new approaches to commerce that balanced profit with social benefit. These traditions influenced Japanese business culture, creating expectations that commercial activities should contribute to social harmony and individual well-being. The political traditions that developed around the governance needs of these institutions created new approaches to leadership that emphasized service, wisdom, and attention to human needs. These traditions influenced Japanese political culture, creating expectations that leaders should understand and respond to the full range of human experience. The philosophical implications of this comprehensive approach to human sexuality extended into every aspect of Japanese intellectual life. Scholars debated whether pleasure was an end in itself or a means to higher understanding. They explored the relationship between individual desire and cosmic order, asking whether personal satisfaction contributed to or detracted from universal harmony. These weren't abstract academic questions, but practical concerns that influenced how people lived their daily lives. The concept of sexual energy as a form of currency became deeply embedded in Japanese economic thinking. Just as rice or gold could be accumulated, traded, and invested, sexual energy was understood as a resource that could be cultivated, conserved, or expended strategically. Wise practitioners learned to manage their intimate resources just as carefully as they managed their material wealth, understanding that both required patience, skill, and long-term planning. This economic metaphor extended to relationships themselves. Partnerships were viewed as investments that could generate returns in the form of pleasure, emotional support, social advancement, and spiritual development. The most successful relationships were those where both parties contributed resources and received benefits that exceeded their individual investments. This created incentives for treating partners well and developing skills that enhanced mutual satisfaction. The taxation systems that developed around commercial sexuality reflected this understanding of intimate energy as economic value. Officials created complex formulas for assessing the worth of different types of sexual services, taking into account not just physical acts but the skill, beauty, education, and reputation of the providers. The most accomplished courtesans were taxed at rates comparable to successful merchants or skilled craftspeople. The insurance systems that emerged to protect practitioners and clients from various risks created new forms of financial innovation. Policies covered everything from injury during intimate encounters to breach of confidentiality agreements. The actuarial calculations required for these policies demanded sophisticated understanding of human behavior and risk assessment that influenced other areas of Japanese commerce. The investment opportunities that arose from the success of pleasure-related businesses created new forms of wealth accumulation. Successful courtesans often became silent partners in other enterprises, using their earnings and connections to build diversified financial portfolios. The entertainment districts became centers of capital formation that financed everything from shipping ventures to agricultural improvements. The labor organizing that emerged among sexual service providers created some of the earliest forms of worker advocacy in Japanese history. Practitioners formed associations to negotiate better working conditions, establish professional standards, and provide mutual support during difficult times. These organizations pioneered techniques for collective bargaining that influenced labor relations throughout society. The retirement planning that successful practitioners developed created new models for managing the transition from active work to later life. Since sexual service was inherently limited by age and physical capacity, providers had to plan carefully for their future security. Many became teachers, business owners, or patrons of the arts, using their accumulated wealth and connections to create sustainable income sources. The charitable organizations that emerged from the wealth generated by intimate commerce created new forms of social support. Successful courtesans often established foundations that provided education for young women, medical care for the elderly, and assistance for families in crisis. These philanthropic efforts demonstrated that commercial sexuality could generate resources for broader social benefit. The educational scholarships that these charitable organizations provided created opportunities for social mobility that were otherwise unavailable. Talented young people from poor families could receive training in arts, letters, or commerce through funds generated by sexual service. This created pathways for advancement that challenged traditional class boundaries. The medical research that was funded by profits from intimate commerce led to advances in understanding human health and physiology. Wealthy patrons supported investigations into fertility, sexual dysfunction, and the connections between physical and emotional well-being. This research produced knowledge that benefited society far beyond the immediate concerns of sexual practitioners. The artistic patronage that emerged from this economic activity supported some of the greatest achievements in Japanese culture. Successful courtesans and their wealthy clients commissioned paintings, sculptures, literary works, and musical compositions that celebrated human beauty and desire. These artistic investments created cultural legacies that enriched Japanese civilization for centuries. The architectural projects that were funded by intimate commerce created some of the most beautiful and innovative buildings in Japanese history. Tea houses, pleasure quarters, and private residences designed to enhance romantic experience pushed the boundaries of construction technique and aesthetic achievement. These buildings served as laboratories for developing new approaches to creating environments that supported human well-being. The technological innovations that emerged from the practical needs of sexual commerce influenced broader patterns of Japanese innovation. The precision instruments used by medical practitioners, the specialized furniture designed for intimate encounters, the architectural features that enhanced privacy and comfort, all contributed to advances in craftsmanship and engineering that benefited society more broadly. The international trade connections that developed around luxury goods used in intimate contexts brought Japan into closer contact with the wider world. Silk merchants, spice traders, and craftspeople from across Asia found profitable markets for their goods among Japanese pleasure seekers. These commercial relationships facilitated cultural exchanges that enriched Japanese practices while spreading Japanese innovations internationally. The diplomatic connections that sometimes developed through intimate relationships created informal channels for international communication. Foreign visitors who formed relationships with Japanese courtesans or other practitioners often became informal ambassadors who promoted understanding between cultures. These personal connections sometimes proved more effective than formal diplomatic initiatives. The linguistic innovations that emerged from the need to communicate about intimate matters with people from different cultural backgrounds contributed to the development of Japanese as an international language. Practitioners learned to adapt their communication styles to work with visitors who spoke Chinese, Korean, Dutch, or other languages, creating new forms of cross-cultural expression. The legal precedents that were established through disputes arising from intimate commerce influenced the development of Japanese jurisprudence in fundamental ways. Questions about contract enforcement, personal autonomy, property rights, and commercial regulation that arose in sexual contexts often became models for addressing similar issues in other areas of law. The administrative innovations that were required to regulate complex intimate commerce created new approaches to governance that influenced Japanese bureaucratic culture. Officials learned to balance competing interests, manage sensitive information, and create policies that achieved social goals without unnecessary interference in private life. The record-keeping systems that were developed to track the activities of pleasure districts created new approaches to information management that influenced administrative practices throughout Japanese government. The detailed documentation required for taxation, regulation, and quality control pushed the boundaries of bureaucratic sophistication. The dispute resolution mechanisms that were created to handle conflicts arising from intimate relationships pioneered new approaches to mediation and arbitration. These systems recognized that matters involving sexuality and emotion required different treatment than purely commercial or criminal cases, leading to innovations in alternative dispute resolution. The privacy protections that were developed to safeguard the confidentiality of intimate relationships created new concepts of personal rights that influenced broader legal thinking. The understanding that people needed protection from unwanted disclosure of private information laid groundwork for more comprehensive approaches to individual liberty. The quality control standards that were established for sexual services created new approaches to professional regulation that influenced other industries. The certification programs, continuing education requirements, and performance standards that were developed for intimate practitioners became models for regulating other skilled professions. The consumer protection measures that were implemented to prevent fraud and abuse in intimate commerce created new approaches to safeguarding buyers in vulnerable situations. These protections recognized that emotional and physical intimacy created special obligations for service providers and special rights for clients. The public health initiatives that emerged from concerns about disease transmission in intimate contexts created new approaches to preventive medicine that influenced broader health policy. The screening programs, treatment protocols, and educational campaigns that were developed for sexual health became models for addressing other communicable diseases. The mental health services that were developed to address the psychological dimensions of intimate commerce created new approaches to therapy and counseling that recognized the connections between sexual satisfaction and emotional well-being. These services pioneered techniques for treating trauma, anxiety, and relationship problems that influenced broader therapeutic practice. And so, we reach the end of our journey through the intimate landscape of feudal Japan, where pleasure was poetry, desire was art, and human connection carried the weight of cosmic meaning. We've wandered through perfumed courtyards where lovers exchanged verses that could ignite centuries of longing, witnessed the careful choreography of seduction in tea ceremonies, and explored pleasure quarters that transformed physical intimacy into spiritual transcendence. This wasn't just a culture that understood sex. It was a civilization that elevated every aspect of human desire into something approaching the sacred. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of cherry blossoms and sliding screens, of lovers who spoke in seasonal metaphors and found eternity in fleeting touches. Sweet dreams, and remember that even in our modern world, there's still magic to be found in the ancient art of truly seeing another soul.